Welcome everyone. This is Simone Chiarchini and you're on Aikido Italia Network. Happy Sunday to everybody. Nice to meet you again for the 5th session of the Aiki Healings. We have a special guest today, a celebrated Budoka and the writer of Aikido things and not only. So welcome to Ellis Amdur. Hi Ellis, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. I hope everybody's good too.
How are you been doing with your COVID-19 days?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I've had almost no work, but that enabled me to publish 3 books last year because I had the time. And I've had the vaccination, so in theory, at least, I'm relatively safe. You know, it's like every other country. America's going through not only the problems it has with the virus, but with the stupidity of all the politicians and all of that. So there's a lot of people managing to make it worse than it otherwise would be, right?
I actually keep tabs on both Italy and Ireland, and I have to say I can only agree with you.
Yeah.
Beside all the problems that we have, well, there's people and politicians. So yeah, that's the way it is. Anyway, let's hope that soon enough we'll see some end to this, or anyway, a few steps back towards some kind of normality, because I think most of us are really looking forward to go back there. So you were mentioning the work you've been doing on your books. It's actually, if there's one good thing about this time, is that one has plenty of time to think or rethink, study, produce. We've all been busy doing that. And talking about your books, obviously you produced a few seminal books on Aikido, works like Dueling with O-sensei and Hidden in Plain Sight. And there's no doubt that these books have greatly contributed to bringing Morihei Ueshiba Sensei and his legacy back among us humans. Okay. And to me, it's quite obvious that that was your plan from the onset. So, and I think it worked. It worked, somewhat worked. Can you explain to us what motivated you to explore this avenue?
Well, you know, the very first thing I started writing was an initial version of what later became Old School, my book on Koryu. But I started that back in 1980, and it had a very different focus at the time, and then I later decided I was co-writing it at the time. I came back to the States 1988, and I hadn't done Aikido in ages. I discontinued Aikido in the late 70s and focused on other martial arts. And I had reconnected with my first serious Aikido teacher, who was Terry Dobson. And Terry Dobson was only the second European American, non-Japanese, if you will, to be in the rather debatable term of Uchi Deshi in the Hombu Dojo. And so I discoursing with Terry, and I ended up writing a small article for a now defunct magazine, and it was on Ukemi. And I'd never published anything before. And the day before the article was due to be published, I got this note: we made a bunch of editorial changes, please let us know by tomorrow. And knowing nothing about publishing, I thought, oh, maybe that's normal, although that's really odd. And there were some things I didn't like, but okay. And then I wrote another article, and it's in the original version is now in the book Dueling with O-Sensei, and it was called Aiki, the State of the Union. And the same thing happened. And that chapter, that essay is kind of colorful, if you will. It's kind of rough spoken. And again, literally the night before it's to be published, I get contacted, please send your editorial comments. And I was so upset with the changes they made, because they stole my voice. This was no longer my article. They still had telegrams in those days. There wasn't much going on the internet. I drove well above the speed limit, because I took it very personally, to a telegraph office and sent a telegram, withdraw permission for publication, do not publish this. And so it got there in time, and they respected that. But I was having a conversation with Diane Skoss. Diane Skoss is a very well-known Budo practitioner. She's currently, among other things, Menkyo Kaiden of Shindo Muso Ryujo. And she was the editor of Aikido Journal, Stanley Prandt's magazine. And I told her this story, and she said, well, why didn't you send it to me? And I said, well, I thought you only publish historical stuff. And she said, no, we want a column from you. And so I now had a deadline and realized I had a lot going on in my head, and started writing really a bi-monthly column of essays about Aikido, which is kind of odd because I wasn't practicing it at the time. But Aikido always remained this puzzle to me, that one way I put it is Aikido is the martial art of the gray areas. It is, and we can go into a lot of detail about this, but it's a martial art that truly is a 20th/21st century martial art suited for civilized people. And I think we start with that, and it's a puzzle then. It's a puzzle that the allegedly most moral martial art has so many less than moral people in it, all the way back to Ueshiba Morihei. Very complex, big figures who were getting deified. And in a sense, Aikido for me became a microcosm of a lot of issues that I was considering concerning the acquisition of power. Then this got even more accentuated. I was borrowing a friend's dojo and teaching small classes of Araki-ryu and Toda-ha Buko-ryu, the two Koryu bujutsu that I do. And he had a dojo with 3 other Aikido teachers and himself. And he said, I'm going on a 6-week trip. Would you take my Aikido classes? And I said, I don't do Aikido. And he expressed some concern that one of the other teachers, who was quite charismatic, would steal all his students while he was gone. So I said, yeah, but I just don't do Aikido anymore. And he said, well, you owe me, which was true because he'd lent me the dojo. And I always paid my debts. And so I started teaching, and I started with an idea which I call respect the house. If I'm a guest in someone else's house, I'm certainly going to be myself, but I'm also going to respect the rules of the house whom I'm a guest in. If I'm a visitor in your house and you say, no shoes, please, I'm not going to insist on wearing shoes. If you say we don't smoke here, I'm not going to smoke a cigar. That's common courtesy. So similarly, if I'm teaching Aikido, I'm not going to say this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. If you were doing Muay Thai, you'd do it this way. I think it's not only disrespectful, it takes a very complex art form and reduces it to a very narrow perspective. So what seemed more interesting to me was to take the Aikido form, unquestioning as it is, and see what, from my 40 years of training, I could offer to contribute to enhancing that Aikido form without doing violation to it, right? Similar to if I'm a guest in your home and you have a gutter falling down, if you ask me, I'll help attach the gutter to the wall, but I'm not going to remodel your house, right? So that then provoked the questions. I had that much more. I started writing that much more. And then I ended up with dueling with O-sensei.
In this very same book, a couple of chapters, you described the golden age of the Aikido and Budo, and you have also portrayed the greats of Aikido, those whose efforts produced the art of Aikido as we have it today. Now, as a reader, I got the impression that the spectrum in both the teaching style and the material was unmatched. When I compare it with today's situation at Hombu, where Aikido is now better known for its conformity to certain standards, I find the clash pretty significant. Is this a good thing, this conformity that we have now at the central school? Or should we look back with longing to the good old days?
You know, if you had the opportunity to walk in successively to Osawa Sensei, Yamaguchi Sensei, Arikawa Sensei, just to pull three's class, and then have the dilemma of trying to make sense of that, why would you want conformity? Now, so from a Koryu perspective, this is an interesting question. So in Araki-ryu, I'm the gold standard of Araki-ryu. There is no, there are other factions, but within my faction, I'm the gold standard of that. In Toda-ha Buko-ryu, we have 5 Shihan, but in my own group, or excuse me, now 7 Shihan, I'm the gold standard, and I expect my students to follow what I do, because there's an explicit, rich curriculum that one has to absorb all the way down to the bone marrow. Now, what I'm actually doing in Buko-ryu, I'm at a point where I'm going to have my students invite every one of the other Shihan of my generation, one by one, to teach, and without me present. And I'm going to ask those Shihan, don't try to change everything. But if you see something that isn't congruent with what you think is right, tell them. And for that week or so, they're going to live according to your lights. Later, I'll come back and we'll see if there's anything we need to change, right? So, but that's at a high level. So in Koryu, there's a particular way to do things, and there are good reasons for it. Aikido that's one of the things I find Aikido puzzling, is it's kind of different. You start with the fact that Takeda Sokaku taught different versions of Daito-ryu to different people. Really different versions. If you compare, for example, the Kodokai and the Takumakai, the only way someone would know seriously that they were the same, quote, martial art is if someone told you, well, they have the same name. It's like, it's like visiting Debussy for a week and then visiting Schubert. They're so different. Now, an informed person in Daito-ryu could say, well, here's all the similarities. Here's where they link up. But they really have a big difference. Takeda Sokaku apparently decided from whatever he knew, he said, well, this is what's good for you. I'm going to emphasize that. This is what's good for you. And the teaching was apparently much more inchoate. There wasn't this specific number of steps. We're going to teach you this first, and everybody goes to this next. And it's sort of like you were always walking into the middle of class with him, apparently.
It wasn't organized.
So that's everything I hear, right? The interesting thing is, from, again, all accounts, there was another level that was organized around the principle of Aiki, but since he didn't teach that explicitly and almost would get mad if you figured it out, even the students who figured it out had to hide that they understood it from it, which has a lot to do with a very odd psychology of a teacher. So then you get Ueshiba Morihei. And from everything I've read, from my understanding, the only person that he explicitly taught, do this, follow this, etc., you know, step by step by step, was Yukawa Tsutomu. And Yukawa was his nephew by marriage, who was probably going to be his successor, was titanically strong. And I remember an account of Shirata Rinjiro, who's one of the greats, right? And Shirata sensei said that when they didn't understand something, they would go to Yukawa to find out what O-sensei explained. So even in the early years of the Kobukan, you already saw teachers, individuals really different. I think this was less of a concern for Ueshiba because of his spiritual goals. He states, and I have this in an essay, it's a quote from in my essay, Aikido is Three Peaches. But he states that the purpose of Aikido is for you, speaking in O-sensei's voice, it's for you to generate the energy for me to put the world in order. And so honestly, it's an image very similar to the Matrix. You are plugged into doing Shihonage and Ikkyo and practicing in dedicated fashion, and Tomiki does it one way and Mochizuki does it another, and whoever does another. Doesn't matter because it's creating spiritual energy for me. Now, I think one of the things that I like about Ueshiba is he made a place for other people to be avatars just like himself. He accepted that. So he had people like Mochizuki or Tomiki who the main line would say, oh, they deviated, they betrayed O-sensei. O-sensei called for Tomiki on his deathbed, right? There was a place in his world for all these deviants. And so people, you have a combination of not learning with explicit instruction. You try to absorb what you can, which means since you might be a very different man than I, you're going to absorb different things. You'll notice different details. And then in Ueshiba's model, it seems like he didn't much care. Taken one step further, the Aikikai is a kind of a special, the Tokyo dojo is a special thing. But when you go to the rural dojos like Iwama or Shingu, up Shirata Sensei's place, if you consider Yoshinkan as a faction, I believe that Ueshiba treated each of those groups like crash test dummies. And he would pick out certain aspects of his interests, and he would emphasize certain interests for Iwama. He would emphasize certain interest in Shingu, in Tanaka Banzen's Osaka, as opposed to with Kobayashi, I can't remember his name, but also in Osaka. And I think he deliberately taught each of these people differently so he could say, okay, if I really push this as far as it would go, what kind of practitioner would I come up with? And that's why, you know, you go to Iwama, people move a certain way. You go to Shingu, they tend to move another way, etc. I think that was deliberate on his part. After World War II, here you have Ueshiba Kishimaru, who I consider such a great man. I admire Kishimaru Sensei so much. That he had a task after World War II of surviving. And he took this concept of harmony that his father had, which was combining the different realms of the cosmos, heaven, earth, man, with man being an ordinal nexus, an ordinal point to order the universe. And Ueshiba said, oh, well, all along we meant social harmony, which was not only you say, oh, well, he did that just to market it. It was exactly what Japan needed after World War II. You have a post-war country in a state of utter chaos. And Kishimaru Sensei had all these incredible alpha teachers, many of whom maybe you could say were better than him. I don't know. He had to have a place for them. So is he going to challenge them and say, you do it all the same way? And he managed to take a provincial art, which would have been utterly insignificant, and he made it something of worldwide influence. Now, I believe there were things that were lost in the process, which is my interest. But I think that Kishimoto Sensei was far more important to the world than Morihei Sensei. More people's lives have been affected positively by what Kishimoto Sensei did in his making a big tent. Now you get to the next generation where I trained some with the next generation. You know, I trained with Yokota-san when he was 19 years old in Koryu Sensei's dojo way back in the day. I trained with the current Doshu. And there was, so one time we'd finished practice and the two of us are standing, we'd just taken off our hakama. And he looked at me, I'm a lot taller than him. I'm 2 meters tall. So he says, how old are you? I said, 24. He said, oh, I'm 24 too. I said, when's your birthday? And his birthday happens to be after mine. And I took my hakama and I threw it at him and I said, fold this, I'm older than you. And, you know, he looked at me for like 20, you know, he's the crown prince. He looked at me for 20 seconds, just his eyes like this. And then it sank in, I was joking, right? Because I just kept my face and he sort of punched me and, you know. So that was my, if you will, kind of relationship with the people. Not that I'm that important, because I was out of Aikido well before I could have possibly become an important person. But I was training with the current generation. And what it seems to me now is there's been a decision that to effectively manage this organization, homogenization is the way to go. And there's a concern, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, that individual expression by younger Shihan would call into question the leadership at the top. I think that's a mistake, but this is just me sitting on the outside. That's the way it looks to me.
Okay. Let's continue with Julian with O-sensei. I found another interesting point, one of many. Kuroiwa sensei and Yamaguchi sensei, teachers under the same roof. Mm-hmm. Two completely different ways ahead for Aikido's future development, we could say. Am I wrong to say that Yamaguchi sensei's concept, as it stands, is the one that took over mainstream Aikido?
I think so. I think so. See, so first of all, Koryu sensei, for those of you who don't know, in my view, he's such a tragic man. Let's just say he was a very good boxer as far as I can tell. He was a middleweight, he was built like Marvin Hagler. And he joined Aikido, as I describe in the chapter, because he had beaten so many people up in street fights, he had no idea of their faces. And a guy one time walked up and said, you don't remember me. You left me in a pile of garbage in an alleyway a couple of years ago. And Koryu sensei was like terrified because he realized he had shamed literally hundreds of people. He didn't even know what they looked like. Anybody seeking revenge could just walk up to him and stab him. He wouldn't even know it was coming. And so he saw this article about Ueshiba, and all he knew was maybe this man could help him in some way change his life. That was as best it could be. Now, you know, this is a man who went into fights without meanness. He was a young, tough, very poor kid from Asakusa-bashi. Didn't like all these rich bourgeois university kids walking around, you know, thinking they were special. And for him, a fight was just men bumping together fist to fist. And one guy lost and one guy won. And as long as it was fair, who cares? Right? It wasn't even violent in a way. It didn't resonate with him like that. And then, you know, this sort of occurred. So he joins the Aikikai. He actually got his arm broken on his very first day by Kato Hiroshi, who, and then Koryu said that Kato, who was still a teenager, his mother dragged Kato by the ear to Koryu sensei's mother and made him apologize. Yeah, they're just kids, right? So Koryu sensei was training, and he's one of those people who has an eye that he could pick up a technique just like that. And so after the regular training, he sort of quickly became like a kind of soto deshi. They had what the other uchi deshi and soto deshi jokingly called the Koryu gakko, where they would hang out in an off hour and try to figure out what all the various teachers were teaching, O-sensei and otherwise. And he did that for about 6 months, even though he was a beginner. You know, he was like kind of the alpha kid in the group. And then his brother got in hock with the Yakuza, and he had to quit coming to morning practice because he was working off his brother's debt. So he loved Aikido at that point, and he had only 6 months of training, so he would practice in his room alone, patterning Aikido technique on uppercuts and hooks. So all of his Aikido movements were this way or this way. Everything was very close in. There was no extended arm. And he was brilliant. He considered Yamaguchi sensei to be his senior, of course, but also his friend. But what he saw Yamaguchi sensei as doing is what I refer to in my book as suburi with people. That the uke's responsibility was to organize himself or herself, organize himself to conform to the training agenda of Tori. And, you know, this is really, shall I say, this is aberrant from a Japanese Budo historical standpoint. Classically speaking, the senior took the ukemi because you had to be good enough to know what the junior needed to know in that particular technique, counter him when necessary, let the throw or, you know, the sword technique go through, being just one step ahead of the junior. Now, the genius of Aikido on a social perspective is this reciprocal practice, no doubt about it, because one of the things that's glorious about Aikido is the housewife or elderly retiree who practices once or twice a week on the mat is equal to the shihan who is taking class, right? So the 6th dan who says, okay, I'm going to take so-and-so's class and is working out with the retiree, there should be absolute equality in practice. And the more skillful person takes the classical uke role in the service of the other person. It's a brilliant innovation that's violated all the time by the senior person saying, you can't throw me, I get to throw you, all that kind of stuff. And so from Koryu sensei's perspective, there was this juxtaposition of a tendency in Aikido from its very beginning that the senior throws, because Takeda would never let anybody throw him. He was too paranoid. Ueshiba would never let anybody throw him, I think, because he was too narcissistic. And, you know, maybe I'm being a little bit too blunt or direct, but that's the way, honestly, I see it. That, and so what happened was there was a culture already in Aikido that the teacher is magical and the teacher can throw. And the irony is, if the teacher's not explicitly teaching something, let's say I am 3 levels above you, and I can throw you whether you like it or not, so well that you go flying away. Well, if I'm not explaining how I'm doing it with special, you know, physical training and all that, the students watching say, oh, that's what's supposed to happen when people do Aikido technique. And so people start taking ukemi. In English, I mean, what an odd term. Ukemi means to receive. How do you take ukemi? If you take ukemi, I know what you want. I'll be there anticipating your desires, right? So you look good. And from Koryu sensei's perspective, as brilliant as Yamaguchi sensei was, and he truly was brilliant, but he set up, he accentuated a movement in Aikido, which is solipsistic. The thrower throws, and uke's responsibility is to conform to that desire.
And this is where we are today, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So,
may I intervene?
Yeah.
Okay. I have a question about the definition of Aikido that's very strong, some linked to what you just said. That Aikido is misogi. this is a very difficult point of view of to understand the correct approach to this. And is this a kind of state of mind that you enter when you practice, or you have to have this state of mind in a holistic manner all around you, are also out of the dojo, or is something that you have only during practice? It's something about polishing your ego from I win, you lose, I win. And taking ukemi, it's sort of misogi.
Well, see, I think there's a lot of terms sort of mushed together there. Misogi is a Shinto term, which is a particular kind of purification of self, but not in the sense of enlightenment or anything like that. So misogi, Shinto is concerned with ritual purity and ritual pollution. And so misogi is austerities to clean yourself up, to put yourself, align yourself with the desires of kami. So there's nothing moral about it. There's nothing salvationist about it. And there's nothing, so I say, enlightenment in a Buddhist sense about it. So if we use the term misogi in its pure form, Aikido is like a kind of a kaguramai. Kaguramai is a ritual dance in a Shinto shrine. And in fact, I have an article about this. I recently, there's always been a puzzle where Ueshiba got his solo Jo form. And I happened to see a ritual of some Shinto priests doing a kaguramai in the Bay of Kamakura. And they were doing some of the same movements that Ueshiba was doing. And I realized that what he had done is he'd taken kaguramai and then re-martialized it. This is a sort of aside to your question. So on the one hand, you can do misogi and so I say it cleans you up, and you now a cleaned up person go out in the world a little bit more powerful. The other thing about misogi is, classically speaking, misogi is specific procedures. Everything from standing under a waterfall, or, and here's real important, things like funakogu undo. Those things that people think are basic warm-up exercises were in fact ritual misogi exercises. Then you have to complicate it with another issue. Ueshiba used those exercises as internal strength training exercises, which is separate from misogi. But to develop the Aiki body, you use those exercises. And in fact, his last iteration of that, he borrowed from the Misogi Kai. And there were several exercises which were Neo-Shinto exercises, among them Funakogu, Ikkyo Undo and stuff. And when I did Aikido, those were just warm-up exercises. Didn't realize those were the key to Ueshiba's power. Okay, sorry for the long preface, but I'm trying to answer your question. If one regards taking ukemi or doing ukemi as a purification of ego, and you say, for example, I am at the service of the person throwing me, and I will not have an egotistic resistance to them. And basically, you can do with me what you will for your benefit, almost like a bodhisattva ideal. That's one way to live and one way to practice. And you could easily carry that outside of the dojo too, right? That you have a human being who is truly living for others, what they perceive of as others' benefit all the time. I don't think that was the original intent of ukemi. It's one way you could choose to do ukemi that could be your practice. That could be one avenue of study. And I'm not going to argue it. It's not something I would want to do. you know, I've seen something, I make a joking term, I call it Aiki accommodation syndrome, which is when a person touches you, you put kazushi on them, on yourself, so they can throw you easier. And I'd done enough Aikido, I hadn't even realized I was doing this until I started doing judo and then later Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I'd start getting pressure and I would open up Koryu Kemi, and then I'd get tapped out and I'd get choked out or whatever, right? So I think the way I see Ukemi is you receive the other person's power and use it in kaishiwaza, in returning it back to them, in countering their attempt to master you. And you can do that with a humble spirit. You can do that with a gracious spirit. You don't have to be violent in spirit, but the training I try to do in any of my martial arts is not to be defeated and yet not use my power, whatever I've acquired, for ill toward any other human being. So that's the best answer I can give. I think Ukemi, a receptive spirit, it is one way to go. I don't even think Yamaguchi Sensei would have said that, because I never heard Yamaguchi take a spiritual approach to this.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's not too far from where we are. I think it's connected. In the last decade, we have seen the coming of what I dubbed harmony light, sugar-free in Aikido. What do you make of the simplistic concept of harmony based on dubious Ueshiba quotes and postmodern hippie ideology that has become dear to mainstream and politically correct Aikido today?
I can't stand it. It's a debasement of something that could be very interesting. It's instead of having a grand affair, you go to a strip joint. It's not challenging intellectually. It's not challenging psychologically. It's not challenging spiritually. And it goes right along with the so-called, this kind of woke ideology of people are tender as opposed to, part of Aikido should be ferocity. Part of Aikido should be virility, and that's for men or women, thinking of the term in the old Latin sense. It's both virtue and it's virile, it's powerful, the people that one respects, I think, most are peaceful people who don't have to be peaceful. And this Aikido light you're talking about, it's almost like, well, I have to be a pacifist because I'm certainly not able to do anything else. And more than just physically, but intellectually as well. I certainly know less about Europe, but America is being just swept by this sort of all these concepts like being triggered, you've offended me, and all this stuff. People are defining themselves as so fragile. At one time, humanity had to worry when you went to the water hole that a saber-toothed tiger was going to pounce on you and kill you. Human history through hunter-gatherer times was a chain of mini genocides, of one tribe killing another. We human beings are glorious for all that we survive and the strength we have. Yeah, sure, we've done evil and all the rest, but all the glory of humanity comes from strength and the ability to withstand things. And if Aikido frames itself as some tender blending with things where we both are smiling on the mat, we never experience any fear, we never experience any power. It's a waste of time, in my view.
And by the way, what are we going to do with our dark side if we simply deny it and we proceed to avoid it in our Aikido training? What happens then?
Well, I think you see that because a dark side denied, creeps up on you, right? If the way to eliminate shadow is shine totally bright light, and on the other side is totally black. It's the absence of light. And so you can have something like, the sanctimoniousness of so many Aikido people, right? Who, there's not only the sneering at other martial arts as being violent, but the sneering of other Aikido factions as being wrong, right? And this sanctimony doesn't come from power, right? And why is it that, within the realm of Aikido, there's a good chance in many dojos you get in this, even in some of the, so to speak, bliss ninny dojos, you could get hurt. Or, there's all kinds of social ostracism and those kind of consequences. I definitely don't want to say that's all of Aikido, because it's not. I mean, before I came here, I just spent 2 hours working with Bruce Bookman Sensei, who's one of my closest friends, and we were doing a weapons Zoom seminar. And, he has a dojo of fine human beings who work for strength. So I don't want anybody listening to have an impression that I'm saying that's all Aikido is. It's insulting and it's wrong. But there is this strain you're talking about, and I don't see any real good benefit coming from denying that part of Aikido is the study of violence. And that's really what it comes down to.
Last week, I had an interesting conversation with Ryon Mekeoi. I don't know if you know him.
I corresponded with him, sure. Yeah.
All right. So among other things, we talked about the challenge he's facing personally, and anyone that has a similar interest to him when proposing a kind of Aikido, a type of Aikido in which cardio, physical development, muscular strengthening are an integral part of Aikido training every day. Why is it that in Aikido today we're in a situation where you almost have to justify yourself for trying to improve your physical power? How come to that?
Yeah, I don't know, because it's certainly what, in the 1950s, the young Deshi were very preoccupied with the thought of dojo yaburi, somebody busting a dojo. So Koryu sensei had developed a koshinage, which was based on a wrestling single leg that would dump the person on top of their head. And Noro sensei, who people, because it was later Kinomichi, don't really understand how incredibly good he was and powerful. He used to do 300 push-ups on his wrists every day to strengthen his forearms. All those guys were training for fights. After practice, the Uchideshi used to always do 2 things: sumo, and they do sparring, knife against a wooden tanto against empty hand. Not, and people say, oh, Tomiki sensei style, sort of at random. It's like, can I stab you, right? And they try also. And sumo, that was in the 50s, that there was a lot of that. They were, you look, I mean, gosh, people think of Endo sensei, and they think of Endo sensei, real soft Aikido. I don't know what he's like now, because he's up in years, but if you ever saw that guy with his shirt off, my God, he was built like a god. Toda sensei, he's skinny, but, man would do saburi for half a day. Iwama, everybody there is a brute, and that's, it's good, so somehow when this got translated to the West, some things got poorly translated intellectually. And like the idea of going with an opponent's force, oh, I don't need any power to do that. You don't use power, and what really it means, you have an efficient use of power, so you don't add extraneous things which actually would make you weaker, right? It's like if I'm cutting with a sword and I cut and I say, I want to be stronger, and I do this with my shoulders to tighten up my shoulders, I'm now weaker because now the shoulders are a leverage point to be deflected. I feel stronger, but I'm weaker, right? The concept of softness. Really what we're talking about is a tensile relaxation. the softness we're looking for is the kind of softness you see in a snake coiling around a tree, right? And from that coil, at its will, it can tighten or loosen, right? It doesn't clench and then open, clench and open. It flows, and that flow is a tensile relaxation of a trained body. These things were not taught, they were not translated well, and so people say, oh, softness. And then they see Ueshiba, who was in his elder years, had his own agenda, and so he'd wave his arms and people would fall. And then people start talking about, oh, that's due to his energy. No.
In the same Aiki Healing session last Sunday, we discussed with Rayan the crystallization of the Aikido curriculum and the consequent suspect reluctance and denial shown by many Aikido Yudansha when presented with anything that doesn't look like standardized Aikido. Those who engage in cross-training are often seen as heretics or people that want to disrespect the founder, in a few words. Isn't it true that Ueshiba Morihei was the cross-trainer and contaminator par excellence amongst us?
Well, it's a funny thing. Ueshiba himself, I mean, really, he was a dilettante in other things and mostly did Daito-ryu, truthfully, right? In terms of his actual study, it's mostly Daito-ryu. But he certainly visited other things, observed other things. But I think more to your point is this. Ueshiba wasn't, at least in his later years, was not concerned about cross-training. There's an infamous story, Shioda said how after hours, they would try judo, because a lot of the guys were judoka. And Ueshiba didn't like that. And he comes running in and he says, stop doing that shinna martial art. It's just a chink. It's a racist term for Chinese.
Okay.
And I mean, that's really going back, because basically what that means is judo is derived from Yoshin-ryu and Kito-ryu, both which have 400-year origin stories of having started from some elements of Chinese martial arts. So Ueshiba was saying, well, 400 years ago, their roots were in China, so you're contaminating my dojo. And I don't know if he was just being racist, if that was his neo-religious stuff about nativist Japanese religion, Omotokyo, or he was just jealous that his students were doing something else. It doesn't bespeak well of him. But at the same time, like, here's an example. Terry Dobson, I've mentioned him already, began training with Wang Shuqin. Wang Shuqin was a Chinese man who had moved to Taiwan after World War II. He's about 165 centimeters. I'm calculating in my head because I use the other system. 165 centimeters and probably 130 kilos. He was like a human bowling ball. And he did Shingi and Bagua. And so Terry started training with him. And he told me how the Uchideshi were saying, you're betraying O-sensei. And he said, I don't want to be O-sensei's student. I want to be O-sensei. And so they more or less dragged him to O-sensei and they said, he's doing this with this Chinese guy. What do you think of that? I said, I don't care. So, the story goes, so Terry, and Don Drager, a well-known fellow, authority of martial arts, they took Tamura, Sao Tome, and Chiba to visit Wang Shuqin. And I've heard this from Terry, I heard it from Sao Tome, I heard it from Drager. There's another story out here, but here's the eyewitness story by 3 people. Wang took one look at Chiba and said, come here, kid. And he knew what Aikido was. And he said, go ahead, try to break my, oh, that's right. He said, punch me in the stomach. Because he was famous that nobody could hit him and punch him in the stomach. So he basically, Chiba punched him twice. There was nothing. And Chiba sort of shrugged, pretended to give up, and then suddenly punched him again, trying to startle him. And this time Wang did this thing that he was kind of famous for, that he would absorb the punch and then with his abdominal muscles, punch you back. and almost dislocated Chiba's arm. And then Chiba got upset and tried to do some sort of wrist lock on him. And Wang just laughed, countered him, and had him down on the ground screaming in pain. Now, as I say, Mr. Chiba had a different story about this. It's online, but I have 3 eyewitnesses who told me about this. I studied with Wang myself. I trained in Chiba Sensei's class. He threw me. The difference between these 2 human beings was huge. Wang Shuqing was definitely on, a superlative level. So the point, I tell a lot of stories, but the point I'm making is Ueshiba didn't care. And again, I think he didn't care because I think he saw in the students who went outside, be it Tada Sensei going to Shinshin Toyutsu, be it Koryu Sensei being a boxer and sort of integrating that. The list goes on and on and on. He saw those people as somebody like himself, who was willing to break the bonds of what he had and make something on his own. And interestingly, he wasn't threatened by it. I think that's a mark that powerful people are not threatened of other people getting powerful. I don't think that Ueshiba Morihei would have told Ryon to stop doing weightlifting. I don't think he would have said, well, you're doing this pro wrestling, that's going to affect your Aikido. That's his problem. And also it's an adult issue. An adult doesn't talk to another adult like they're a child. If that's what Ryon chooses to do with his life, fine. If O-sensei says, well, because of that, I'm not going to teach him this, this, and this, that's on Ryon, right? If this is all hypothetical, right? But let's say Ueshiba said, this guy's doing too many leg locks. I was going to teach him the secret of internal strength. I'm not going to teach him because he's into his own thing. That's adult to adult. But this idea that you shouldn't cross-train because it's an insult to the teacher, the only way that's a problem is if the cross-training interferes with the teacher's ability to teach. So from my perspective, teaching Koryu, there's a particular way we cut with a sword. Let's say I'll take Toda-ha Buko-ryu. And one thing when we cut with a sword is you never let the tip of the sword go past 10 degrees vertical. Okay? When you cut, you drop. You don't cut hinging from the shoulders. Now, I have some students who also do modern Iaido. It's either Muso Shindenyu or Muso Jikine Shinga, I don't remember what. But they have that hinging shoulder cutting with the arms pretty straight. And that has interfered with their ability to advance. They finally got a hold of it, but honestly, if I couldn't teach them because their body kept doing the other thing, at a certain point I might say, look, you're going to have to choose because I can't teach you anymore. The information I want to teach you cannot get through to you as long as you're using your body that way. So that is a legitimate, so I say, complaint on the part of a teacher with a student who they're intimate with. Now, another issue with Aikido is because it's a big tent and you have big classes, how many students are really your students and how many are attending your class? So if, let's just hypothetically, and again, I don't mean any disrespect to Ryon, he's a generation younger to me. I'm just using him on that. So let's say Ryon is my student and he's just in my class. Frankly, I wouldn't care what he's doing outside the dojo, right? As long as he doesn't disrupt my class, whatever he's bringing, be it good or bad, well, that's just more energy for the class. If I say to Ryon, I really want to teach you everything I know. And he's like, great, I want to learn everything you know. And we start working together and something he's doing in training, some reflex he's created is interfering with my ability to impart physical information. I'm going to let him know. And if he doesn't get better at that point, I'm saying, hey, you're going to have to choose. I'm not saying I'm better than what everybody else is doing, but you're not going to learn more of what I'm doing if this is in the way. Now, honestly, I've watched a couple film clips around. There's nothing I'm saying that that's true for in terms of Aikido. I'm saying that's a legitimate question if the teacher is not able to teach due to somebody's cross training. But other than that, I guess sorry, I'm babbling away. The other question is, and that goes back to this respect the house question. So Bruce Bookman, who is also a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and that's still a legitimate rank, which means you legitimately have achieved a lot of skill. And so he does something he calls, I think, Aiki extensions, where he has blended BJJ within Aikido. And there's some very good videotapes of that on Aikido Journal. But he also teaches classical Aikido as classical Aikido. Because, not just because it's an art form that needs to be preserved, but it has merits that can only be achieved if you do it in the classical form. The same way you will never be a great boxer unless you concentrate on boxing, right? Yeah, so I think what Bruce does is the best way I've seen to do it, which is you have your classic form and then you have your extensions where you begin to blend your cross training within it while still trying to maintain Aikido principles.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Earlier you mentioned Morihei Ueshiba Sensei and his time in Daito-ryu. And has he cloned Daito-ryu, as they always maintained on that side of the fence? Or has he completely reshaped it and transcended its original meaning, as they taught us Aikido students to say?
Neither. Okay, so first of all, Stanley Pranin showed Takeda Tokimune the 1936 film of Ueshiba. And Tokimune Sensei's response was, Yappari, sore wa Daito-ryu. So you consider it, the oldest film of Daito-ryu we have is Ueshiba Morihei. Actually, there's an older one that's just come out on, you may have seen it, there's a film of the Omotokyo headquarters where you have Ueshiba 1934, 1935 doing something. There's a mythic film allegedly that may possibly exist of Takeda Sokaku taken without his knowledge. So I have been told that it may exist. I just went all over the place at the Asahi. But it's never, I don't know. That may be true, maybe not, but some people have alleged that. But otherwise, the oldest Daito-ryu film is Ueshiba Morihei. The oldest Daito-ryu text beyond the scrolls is the Takeshita diary. Yeah, Admiral Takeshita took a diary of his training with Ueshiba. I think there may be one other notebook somewhere, but it's pretty cryptic. It doesn't have any, I can't remember if it's Yoshida Kotaro or I don't remember. Anyway, so the other thing is, if you really look at Ueshiba, don't look at his uke. You look at his gestures, you look at the things he did. He was still doing a lot of Daito-ryu as Daito-ryu to this dying day. He would always finish a form where he would, do this double thing with the hands. I'm sorry, I'm gonna, but and basically he's balancing his energy, and I'm not talking about mystical energy. I'm talking about as a balancing of forces in the body in a symbolic level. So it's not just a dramatic pose. That's pure Daito-ryu. Now, what's not fair to Ueshiba is this. Traditionally speaking, in Japanese martial arts, if you, for whatever reason, have chosen to do things significantly different from your teacher, not only in technique, but in thinking, in attitude, then it's more respectful to change the name. It's not respectful to say, Ueshiba took very little from Daito-ryu, he did all these other martial arts and combined them. That's not respectful. And I don't know that he ever said that, but other people said that, right? But BJJ is not, you sometimes hear judo because, BJJ is just judo. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's become something different. Just like judo is not Tenjin Shinryu, just like sambo is not judo. I had this happen in my own, I had a senior student in Araki-ryu, and I gave him, permission to start his own group. And I went and looked at it, and he was doing some things really different from me. It's so that I'd say, I'm not saying bad, but I'm saying different enough that I say that can't be identified with me. But so we had a discussion about this, and so it's now called Araki Shinryu, right? And if somebody says, oh, but he's doing the same kata that Ellis Amdur is doing, it's different as far as both of us are concerned. Yeah. So there is absolutely no doubt. I mean, John Driscoll did a study. It's on my kogenbudo.org website. He found the only technique in the entire Aikido corpus that you don't find in Daito-ryu is Ueshiba's way of doing Koshinage. The perpendicular bodied Koshinage. Basically, he was not able to find that in any curriculum. And you do find that in Yagyu Shinganyu, which is an art that Ueshiba studied for a few years previous. So that one technique is different. In terms of his sword and staff, I did a lot of trying to trace these things down. In some places, he taught a sword where the movements were based on Yagyu Shinkage-ryu, 3 kata. In Iwama, he based movements on Kashima Shinryu, but no Kashima Shinryu person would claim those forms. The ma'ai is different, the usage of the weapon is different, the same thing with the Yagyu. So he would take different forms, get inspired by them, and put his art in them. So they're Aiki-ken, they aren't Yagyu Shinkage-ryu. So that's my answer. I think that Ueshiba deserves the respect to say he did things so differently in terms of mind that he was using Aikido as a kind of misogi, to go back to something as Carlos said, that he had different objectives. He call it his moral objective, whatever. He projected people out from the throw as opposed to folding them inward. Whereas Daito classically is going to put you in a space that you can't escape from. Whereas in Ueshiba's art, generally speaking, he gets you to a place of vulnerability and then sort of open up a space for you to fall. And that's a different interpretation of the same waza. So I think the same way, gosh, what was his name? There was a fellow who was in the Takumakai who then moved, he started training with Tokumune sensei. There was all sorts of politics. And so instead of calling what he did Daito-ryu, he called it another name, which I've now forgotten. He was in the Osaka area. So he had his own organization. Or Okamoto Seigo, the Roppokai,
Byaku Shinkokai.
Pardon me?
Byaku.
Yeah, the Byakokai, thank you. That was it, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so there are these different organizations where they're basically saying, for political reasons, for respect, or I believe I've made enough change, I'm going to change the name. And I think that's fair for Ueshiba. It's not fair to say it's totally an invention of this genius and has nothing to do with Daito-ryu. That's a misrepresentation.
Okay, let's stay with Daito-ryu. Every day now, almost every day, there's new videos popping up in which, without any filter or explanation, the most subtle, advanced, esoteric aspects of Daito-ryu and Aikido, we could add, are shown. Do you think it makes sense to present to the public, to inexperienced students or unaware strangers, the real or presumed phenomena of Aiki? Is there any point in showing people being knocked down with a gesture, electrified by contact alone? No, these things once were reserved for the chosen ones and jealousy guarded, no? What is it with all this Aiki marketing that we're seeing lately?
Well, look, I mean, there's a couple of problems. The first thing is, one, can I see that and do that? So in one sense, it's irrelevant. I can look at it and I say, I can slow it down frame by frame. I can't reproduce it. So the first question is, I don't even watch that stuff now, right? So that's number one. Number two, is it really happening? In other words, is there an Aiki accommodation going on that the person puts kazushi on themselves and then this action occurs? Or does it happen to somebody who is not coached into a particular position? Like there's a DKU is a pretty popular neo-systema guy out of Korea. And he does a 1-inch punch kind of thing or a shoulder strike. But people say, well, how should I stand? He makes sure they're standing with their feet lined up. Well, if you line up your feet this way, you can just shove somebody in the shoulder and they fall back. So there's no proof of it's set up, right? The person doesn't think so, they don't know so, but they're really set up. So similarly, the next question is the Daito you're seeing, is that dependent on the uke response? And honestly, I'd love to feel it myself. Yeah, I'd love it if it's real. I'd love it. You know, I'm willing to believe conditionally that it's real because so many, Ueshiba among them in his young days, he was respected by so many powerful martial artists. And maybe they're all self-congratulatory fools and none of them could do anything, or he really had something. And so, I mean, the end up answer to me is why people choose to demonstrate their gokui publicly. I don't know. It's not something, it's not to my taste in my own art, the things that I study. I'm sure there's a lot of motivations for it, but the end result, I don't think it'll hurt anything or help anything. I really don't think that you would watch that and say, oh my gosh, I got to try that. I guess the worst thing that happened is you spend the next 50 years trying to learn it from a film instead of just going over to the guy and ask him to teach you.
Well, it might hurt the art publicly because people that are from outside of this community, they haven't a clue. They only see people falling for no reason. So, but anyway, no problem.
But honestly, is that not an endemic problem with Aikido as a whole, right? That, you know, and then you see that young man Rokas, who has made quite a fortune for himself, I suppose. I'll be blunt. If I lost a fight, I wouldn't publicize it and I wouldn't make a business out over the fact that I lost the fight. I keep it to myself, right? So I think there's a real question there. If you view your Aikido as a martial art and you spar with somebody and what you do doesn't work, well, you're faced with a couple choices. The one choice is, okay, I quit. I'll do something else. And I'm not going to tell anybody because I don't want people to know I lost, right? The second thing is to say, since at least on record, there are people who were very powerful in Aikido, Shirata Rinjiro, for example, who took lots of challenges. And there's sort of an underground story that he beat Hisa Takuma in a sparring match as well, right? What were the rules? I don't know. But there were these very strong guys who took on all comers. And to say, well, gee, there's something missing in my Aikido, and I love Aikido, I'm going to recover it. What is it that's missing? And if it was that important, I would find that out. If atemi is 90% of Aikido, why does my atemi not work? Because atemi, you can't say atemi is just sort of swinging your arm up in the middle of a technique and bopping somebody. Atemi is a hitting body. And it means that whenever you make contact with somebody at any range, you should be able to shake them, right? Which requires a particular kind of training, which most people don't do. So either you love your Aikido and find out what's been missing now, or you do quit, right? But so because of that, people look at Aikido Embu on the web and Aikido's a joke to a lot of people, right? And, you know, it's like some Aikidoka get real mad about that. But I think where I'm a guest in Aikido. That's the way I regard myself. But were I a full-time Aikidoka, I would be mad at the people making me look stupid and making my art look stupid.
I can only agree there. Now, a couple of months ago, I interviewed John Bailey. He's a student of Tony Graziano and Tom Walker. I don't know if you have ever...
No, I don't.
Anyway, John has an extensive background in security and a career built on hands-on work with violent people. So he's has been on the field.
I think I read that interview. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Now, in John's opinion, Aikido suffers from performance problems, and among other things, this has a lot to do with what he calls the level of contrivance within our practice. Obviously, all kinds of training have contrivance, even randori competitions in DMMA, you have rules and do not. It's not a real fight. But John's point was that Aikido is mostly done at a very high level of contrivance. So basically, kata with a partner, and it stays a kata with a partner. So he was suggesting that maybe what is missing is a method for bridging from high to a lower level of contrivance. What are your views on this? Is it possible? It is doable, or the way it's taught doesn't allow that anymore?
Well, it's who's doing the teaching, right? Certain teachers, of course, it's not going to change. But if you're in a position to teach, either you know how to do that, or you have the humility to learn how to do it if you see it's a flaw. So on the one level, one does like what Bookman Sensei is doing, which is, you may basically, he does a lot of entries with a cover, right? And he might lead with a little foot jab like the BJJ guys do, getting close. And then if you find yourself in a tackle, you tackle. You find yourself in an Aiki move, you do an Aiki move. And so he's phase shifting. He's shifting from one to the other and getting closer to that live kind of training. So that's the one thing. The second thing is, I see Aikido Waza from a kind of a different perspective. So if you bear with me for a second. So once upon a time, there was solo training, which was done for a specific purpose. Suburi could be part of that, different exercises, the Misogi exercises. They weren't just exercises to make yourself holy or purify yourself. They were exercises to train the body in a particular way, very specialized way. So I'm going to get up here for just a second. So the Aiki body is the body of, like, as I say, like a python, an anaconda, somebody powerful and flexible at the same time. Now, when you do Suburi, you train on, let's see, where? There we go. I have swords hidden all over my house. So we're taught shibori, right? So when you cut, people say, wring the sword like you're wringing a rag. That's incorrect. You wring your body. The sword you hold, the wringing goes on here. You're training the connective tissue to stretch and coil at the same time, not lock down the sword, right? So Suburi done that way teaches you how to grab hold of another human being with a startling level of control and power because you're sensitive. Now, I'll show you a device that I use to train with. This is a piece of hard rubber. And this isn't original to me. I learned from a man named Mike Sigmund. I twist it. It wants to twist back. It's pretty stiff. I'll now move, and I have to move. Let's see if I can lower this a little bit. As I move, I want to be using no more force than is necessary to maintain the twist it is now. It's not going to twist out of my hand. I'm not going to clamp it down, but I maintain through the entire movement this smooth circle using no more strength. Working like a chimpanzee. The chimpanzee swings through a tree, it grips, but the rest of its body is relaxed, right? Now, I believe that one of the sort of secrets of Aikido is when I attack you and we make contact, you're now the tori are actually the uke. What you've done is you've received power, and you are going to efficiently use your whole body with joints open and connected to begin to move me against my resistance. Now, the easiest resistance is if the person just clamps down, then you slip and you punch him, right? But if the person has a martial body and is giving you resistance, looking for the counter, you are, as you move the person through whatever the technique is, as you move, you make adjustments in your body to maintain that dominance over them physically, right? As I say, I call it tensile relaxation. So in a sense, both people are training the Aiki body through the Aikido waza. So on that level of training, the fact that we're striking this way as opposed to this way, for that training, it's less relevant, right? So if you regard the basics of Aikido as a physical training to create a body able to function as a unified, connected entity, rather than sticking my arms out and then trying to push them, my whole body weight comes into whole move. So funakogu, when we're doing funakogu, it's not, hey, that's nonsense. Use the whole body back. I one time saw a guy who was a bouncer describe how he would win his fights with funakogu. Yeah, he'd shove the guy back, then he brought him forward, bang, headbutt. So there's the one level that classical Aikido conceivably can create somebody who is, should I say, remarkably strong for their size, creating an easy way to put it, rather than internal strength, creating a chimpanzee body in a human flesh. Okay, and then the techniques like Shihonage, all those techniques, they're perfect for that. Then from a fighting standpoint, which is different from a strength standpoint, then you consider something, I'm sorry, what was the man's name again? Was it John Walker?
Bailey.
John Bailey. What John Bailey's talking about is, okay, whatever strength you've developed, you have to be able to apply it in these circumstances you're in, right? And these days, people don't tend to attack this. Well, they do with a knife, but empty-handed, you don't attack like that. Since they're different attacks, can you apply those principles in those attacks? And that you have to explicitly put in your Aikido practice. Right? Do you remember that movie, Field of Dreams? There's a baseball movie with Kevin Costner. And there's that phrase, if they build it, they will, if you build it, they will come, right? If you build the baseball field, Aikido and like that, no martial arts like that. You can't practice divorced from combat and build up strength and expect you can apply it. There's a perfect example of that. There's a Chinese martial art called Yi Chuan. Yi Chuan mostly practices post standing. The Yi Chuan guys are remarkably strong for their size. And it was developed by a guy who distilled Yi Chuan down from Xingyi. He was like the Morihei Ueshiba to the Xingyi guys. Distilled out what he needed. And he was pretty well known, so they say is a great fighter. But now a couple generations, the Yi Chuan guys doing the same training, they spar with the Kyokushinkai guys and always lose. Always. Because their bodies are remarkably developed in very specific ways, but they don't practice fighting. So again, I know that some people who do Aikido say, wait, all this talk about fighting, that isn't what I'm doing Aikido for. I get that, but at the same time, since we're practicing force on force, body on body, if I know I'm too weak to handle force, then I lack integrity in my Aikido. I'm always doubting myself. If I have enough power to exert force, I have enough power to withhold force. Right? You know, and so it seems that it's that way for any martial art, right?
Yep.
You know, when I was doing Muay Thai, in the Aki, we used to do a lot of sparring, and my teacher used to always beat me, and I was trained in Muay Thai, and when I got him in a clinch, and I just hit him with some roundhouse knees. And, you know, it's like I pulled him at the last minute, but I pummeled him, and it felt wonderful to beat my teacher. And next week we're sparring, and I went to do the same thing. That whole week he'd been brooding about how he got beat. And just when I started the knees, he did a semi-foot sweep. I staggered, and they took me over in a hip throw, and then punched me in the head, right? And he said, never twice, never twice. Right? So for him, and then as best I can for myself, for me, the art power has got to be part of the art, and that includes Aikido. Yeah, whatever art you're doing.
Carlo, is there anything else you want to ask?
Something about extending the ki. Because Aikido develops in different forms during the practice.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the aim of extend your ki beyond and maybe outside the body?
Ah, okay. Well, there's so ki is one of these incredibly big words, is it not? In both Chinese qi and in Japanese ki. It means so many things. So if we are talking about ki as a kind of telekinesis, where, for example, there you are sitting wherever you are, and I go like this and you fall back. I wish I could do that. I wish to God I could do it, because I would be pushing so many people around, right? I'd be looking at the TV and I'd be knocking people off their chairs. If we regard ki as, in the sense, the word charisma, which is actually similar, it's come to a similar idea, that you have this intangible energy. Can I affect somebody with my will? I was part of a study, it's called, there's an agency in America called DARPA, that's part of the Pentagon, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. And they're usually studying things like laser guns and new cannons and high technology. But they did a study, it was called the Good Stranger Study. And the question was, how can we teach American warfighters, soldiers, how to communicate with our enemies? Because it's not just a matter, there's a battlefield, then you occupy an enemy territory, you're now maybe there for many years, like the Americans haven't left Afghanistan in 22 years. You're going to be communicating with people who are your enemies. And so I got brought in, they had a bunch of research scientists, and what DARPA usually does is they bring in the top research scientists, and then they bring some people, some crazy people from outside. And I was the crazy person. And what I presented was the psychology of human relationship with people who are in conflict. Because the Koryu studies I did had a very deep psychology of ki, extending ki into another human being. And the better term for ki in this case would be ki-ai. So usually we think of ki-ai as a shout, hey, like that. But ki-ai is anything that causes another person to act differently than they would have if you had not been there. Ki is anything that I do to organize myself to have an effect on the world. So right now, as I'm speaking, I'm using certain gestures, not only because they help me shape my thoughts, but to get your attention. When I wasn't thinking this consciously, but when I do this, it means small point, pay attention. That's ki, right? The tone of voice I take, the way I talk to people, I'm trying to establish a particular relationship with you, as far away as you all are, that I have respectful influence with you. Okay, so it is not my belief, it is my experience that Budo training can enable you to develop charisma, to get people to pay attention to you when you have something to say, to maintain your calm when not. For those interested, I wrote 2 books on this subject. One was co-written. One's called The Coordinator, and that's for police and warfighters, but another's called The Accord Agent. And it was applying these principles to business, but it's basically daily life. And it's how do you communicate with people who are in an adversarial relationship to you? Now, if you think about it, is that not Aikido in day-to-day action? So we're not touching, and yet my goal is to ascertain a way that I can move you in a way that I either is best just for me or is really best for the situation. Let's think of it in selfless terms. So in that sense of extending ki, I think that any martial art, Aikido being one of them, really has a potential for teaching people that. And again, what is it, if I don't, one of the best ways to know how to get people to treat you seriously is to physically require that they treat you seriously. So for example, if you and I are practicing Aikido and you do an attack, and I know if I let that hit me, I am going to be hurt, then I have to pay attention to you. And now I have the added task. I can't just counterattack and try to stab you in the eye with my fingers. I'm now bound by using Aikido technique to neutralize your attack. This is what happens in social situations all the day. Your boss comes in and expresses some unhappiness. You don't want to crawl. You don't want to lose your job by yelling at your boss. If your boss is wrong, you want to maintain your integrity and keep your dignity. Itami, right? And you are going to be a person better prepared for that if you have taken strong attacks in the dojo where there's a chance it's not going to work out. You're talking about ukemi. Taking ukemi in whatever way we take it and realizing if I don't do this just right, I'm going to get hurt. And I learn courage. I learn adaptability. I learn to bounce back. To me, these are all a real extension of ki. Separate from the, the sort of martial art thing that, from a distance, I hold up my hand and you begin to fall or something like that. I think there's a possibility that that way of doing ki can create a kind of overconfidence or grandiosity in somebody. There's that infamous tape of the Aikijutsu ki master who had the fight with the young MMA guy, right? And it's just, right? And he really thought he had all these people, he'd wave his arms and they'd fall. So on that level, I don't assume that you're assuming that question, but that kind of extension of ki I'm not interested in. But the ability that from a powerful position of integrity, I can influence other human beings to the good. That's something that for me was created in martial arts. In the book Dueling with O-Sensei, there's several chapters about my work as a crisis intervention specialist and how I faced people who either meant me harm or meant somebody else harm. And definitely I was, to use that terminology, extending ki to move the situation and the person in the direction that was ultimately for peace. Yeah.
Okay. change the subject.
Grazie.
Yeah, sure.
Since I started training as a child back at the beginning of the 70s, I always felt that Aikido was a safe environment, a place culturally free from the divisive arguments that poison society. I heard many times being said from my teachers that Aikido was the big equalizer, like everyone on the mats, we don't care who they are, where they come from. We're only students walking the path. No, this was, it had been said many, many times. But in the meantime, things seems to have changed because the current political correctness that pervades contemporary society is bringing discourse on gender equality, LGBT, racism, etc., into Aikido. So instead of bringing Aikido values into society, we're letting people with an agenda to politicize our practice. What is your opinion on this?
Well, two. There's a dojo that's one of my dojos close to my heart. It's Aikido of Etna. It's in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And those guys and women, they've been brothers and sisters for like 30, 40 years. And one guy is think of him as a very strong Trump supporter. And here's something interesting. If I say that, some people, I bet you're going to wince. Oh my God, right? Why? Right? Is that, other people are very much on the liberal side and all that. They love each other. And they realize that ideas are ideas. We can learn from other people's ideas. So that's number one. Number two, this is an Aikido, but Araki-ryu. I teach in Greece, and some of my students are pretty far left. I'm pretty conservative politically. And I one time asked my senior student, you know my political beliefs aren't the same as yours. I really disagree with you. Does that bother you? And he said, no. He said, I respect you, so I'm always going to listen to you. And when I disagree with you, I figure that's just Guru Kemi practice. How do I roll with it, right? How do I maintain a relationship when I really disagree with somebody? And then as a third sort of example of this, which actually goes directly to your question. Many years ago, I was teaching a small group of people sword. And it just so happened it was 8 men and 1 woman. It just so happened the woman was a fairly high rank in Aikido, but that just so happened. So we would practice at the top of this old priory. It was a Catholic priory and it had been turned into something else. And so there was an attic with 40-foot high ceilings and wooden floors. It was a wonderful place to practice. Then we take a freight elevator down. So all 10 of us could fit in the freight elevator. And so we're going down and the woman all of a sudden looks around and goes, you know what this dojo needs? This dojo needs more feminine energy. And I looked at her and I said, I don't give a shit about that. And she sort of started, and I said, really, I don't give a fuck about that. That has nothing to do with what we're doing here. So we lost a little bit of feminine energy we had because she didn't come back. The thing is, if I had only women, I don't care that either. If I had only gay practitioners and no straight practitioners, I don't care about that either. All I care about is, are you going to train with heart and integrity? And it is, to me, it's an obscenity to bring those kind of issues when we're studying how to be graceful, powerful people. And graceful, powerful people don't gain power by playing a victim, by scolding other people using the upper hand of whatever political idea du jour there is. Right? That's such a craven, ugly way to take power away from other people. And, one gets intimidated. There literally, I could if I express some of my political opinions in certain circles, I wouldn't work, literally. I don't suppress them, I don't unsuppress them. But for example, I'll be teaching a group of social service folks, therapists, who in Seattle are almost all far on the left. And I ask a question, I said, let's say you have a client who comes in, his marriage is breaking up, his kid is suicidal, and he's wearing a Make America Great hat, and he has a Donald Trump sticker on his car. Could you do therapy with them? And I see a lot of people get uncomfortable. And I say, if you are uncomfortable, then you have just said you're not a therapist.
You should change job.
Right, because the word therapist comes from a Greek word, which is terops, and terops means to attend to. Attend to means to take ukemi, right? When you attend to another person, you're taking ukemi. And so my answer to that is, it's an obscenity to bring that kind of stuff into the dojo. Now, if somebody does something that is genuinely ugly, right? If I go into your dojo and I sexually harass one of your students, I should be thrown out, right? That's not a matter of politics, that's a matter of conduct. But if I express an opinion that, take your pick of, if I were French, I'd vote for Le Pen, right? If I say that, whether I believe it or not, that's not an issue. But if I say that, and that causes me any problems in your dojo, there's something wrong with your dojo culture. Sure, if somebody says, Joseph Stalin is my hero and I can't wait for the next gulag, there are extremes beyond extremes. But that's not what we're talking about most of the time. Yeah. My Araki-ryu teacher was one of the last of the men in Japan who belonged in pre-war Japan, that particular messianic right-wing perspective. He hated Americans. I was his last student because he felt an obligation to teach me because of my sincerity to learn, because of my intent. That somebody had taught him out of the same motivation. That you don't teach, in my world, you don't teach because, oh, that's my job and I love it and I love to help people. It's somebody gave you something wonderful, and the only way you can repay that is to pass it on. You have to, you're obligated to. And so to then pick and choose in terms of politics, no.
Okay. I think we're at the end of this truly engaging and insightful conversation. Thanks a million, Ellis. Thanks for this.
You're welcome.
Certainly, there's some reflections to be done, to be had. And I hope that the guys that have been connected are happy to have been here. We're going to prepare, as usual, an article for Aikido Italia Network with a transcript of the interview. And obviously, we're going to publish the full video as well. So any questions, just use the Facebook page and we'll take it from there. Thanks a million, Ellis. I hope that soon enough, wishful thinking at the moment, but soon enough we'll be able to bring you to Europe and bring this conversation into something a bit more practical. But that's, for now, it's just a plan, yeah?
I'd love to. I've been to Ireland once. I want to come back. So, yeah.
So, okay. Thank you, everybody. See you soon. Next Sunday, we have another session. We're going to talk about Hideki Osokawa Sensei. Used to be one of my teachers. And unfortunately, an ailment has sidelined him for many years now, way too early in his life. And I'll be joined by some other of Osokawa Sensei's senior teachers, and we'll try and tell you a few stories about him, about his life, and deeds in Aikido. Okay. Finally, please, if you can, give us a contribution to keep this work going, and donate buttons are available on our homepage and at the bottom of each article that we publish. Thanks for your generosity. Ellis, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Nice to meet
everybody.
you.
Arrivederci.
Arrivederci.